You'll never look at a mall Santa the same way after hearing this story. So this photo was taken around 1920 in a Christmas fair happening outside of Boston. The young child in this photo is Alberta Porter, the daughter of Robert Porter, who was supposed to be Boston's next mayor. Apparently, this Santa had set up around the corner from the rest of the fair and was not visible from the rest of the fair. Robert and his daughter actually didn't even see this Santa until they were walking home. The line to see Santa inside of the fair was way too long, so when Alberta saw this Santa, she started crying and begging her dad to take a photo with him. So this photo was taken, and afterwards, the Santa asked if Alberta wanted to go on a short ride on the donkey. And she starts crying and begging her father again, so he agrees. But Alberta never returned. An hour went by and Santa still hadn't brought her back. Robert ran into the fair to ask an employee how long the donkey rides typically last, but the employee seemed really confused. There was no Santa with donkey rides at this fair. The employee pointed to the Santa who had a long line of children out in front of him and said that was the only Santa at the fair. Alberta was never found, and Robert actually dropped out of politics to spend his entire life and savings on finding her and the man who took her, and never did.
These are the updates regarding the 4 Idaho students that were murdered. On November 14th, 2022, 4 University of Idaho students were found stabbed to death in their beds in a home that they shared. The victims were 20-year-old Ethan, 21-year-old Kaylee, 21-year-old Madison, and 20-year-old Xana. The 4 victims also lived in the home with 2 other roommates who were not hurt, and records show that one of the roommates heard crying coming from Xana's room and the voice of a man. That same roommate also made eye contact with the murderer, and he walked right past her, but she could not recognize him because he was wearing a mask. But almost 2 months later, police finally arrested 28-year-old Brian Kohlberger, who was also a PhD student at Washington State University studying criminology. Records show that his phone was near the victim's home hours after the murder and was used about a dozen times near their home since last June. His white Hyundai was also captured on surveillance, and he decided to change his license plate 5 days after the murders. This is where things get a little creepy. So records show that sometime last year, he posted a research survey on Reddit asking ex-convicts to share their experience and feelings about past murders they've committed. And now people are comparing Brian to Ted Bundy and think that he has been studying and planning how to get away with murder for a while now.
This girl killed her mum so that she wouldn't find out she got kicked out of school. On the 3rd of March 2020, police were called to do a welfare check at a property in Ohio. Brenda Powell lived in the house, the 50-year-old mother of Sydney Powell. Brenda had actually been on the phone with Sydney's former school. This was the University of Mount Union. Now, during the telephone call, a staff member heard repeated thuds and screaming, so authorities were alerted. Inside, they found Brenda Powell in a serious condition. She was rushed to hospital but died from her injuries. Brenda had been unaware that her 19-year-old daughter had been kicked out of the school. During her telephone conversation, Brenda was struck in the head and then stabbed nearly 30 times by Sydney. However, when police investigated the murder, Sydney tried to claim that there had been a break-in. She told them that there had been a noise and her mum had instructed her to run away. She said she heard screaming, and when she ran back in, her mum was on the floor. Investigators saw through her lies and she eventually changed her story. At her trial, she pled not guilty by reason of insanity. Her defense argued that Sydney was suffering from undiagnosed schizophrenia. They stated that she killed while experiencing a psychotic episode. However, it is rare for people with schizophrenia to act violently. It was concluded that Sydney had been exaggerating her symptoms. She's recently been found guilty and is awaiting sentencing.
The mystery of the Bloody Children's Playhouse is one that will haunt you, especially because it's still unsolved. So January 2012 in Australia, the staff of Riverwood Primary School discover a massive pool of blood inside of a children's playhouse on property. This is the actual playhouse pictured here. The blood puddle was over 30 centimeters wide and contained about 1.5 liters worth of blood. That's a lot of blood. So obviously they called the authorities in to try to see what the hell had happened, how this blood had ended up in a kid's play area, and they did some tests on it and discovered that it belonged to a young male. But they couldn't find any matches, they didn't know who the blood belonged to, and this amount of blood was much more than simply a bloody nose or an injury. Authorities believe this would have had to be a substantial wound that this young boy or man had to have sustained in there. They even said that there's no real way that they should have been able to actually walk out of the clubhouse, and that they would have had to be carried by somebody. But this story gets even stranger. So when the authorities looked into recent missing persons cases, or absent student records from the school, they couldn't find anybody that had gone missing around that time. The police also searched through hospital records for that time period because obviously somebody losing that much blood would have had to go to the hospital, but nobody had checked themselves in around that time with any sort of injury that matched what could have happened inside of that cabin. So the police to this day think that this blood belonged to a young child who was probably murdered. But keep in mind, this is a small cabin built for children to play inside of, so adults can't even stand up straight inside of it. There was also no blood trail leading in or outside of the building. Police have searched the areas around the wetlands and all of the forests and areas in that town. They haven't found any trace of a child, and no children have been reported missing. So to this day, this is a case that haunts me, that really confuses me. And I'd like to think that there might be some sort of closure in the case at some point, but this is a story that I really think will never have an ending. But let me know your theories on what might have happened here below.
This is why babysitting always freaks me out. So in 2014, Sarah DeWalt was babysitting for a new family that had just moved into her neighborhood in Ohio. The family consisted of 2 young children under 10, but when Sarah showed up that night, the parents kept talking as if they had 3 children. There were 3 sets of pajamas laid out, there were 3 bowls of ice cream on the counter, but the family clearly only had the 2 kids. So that night, Sarah and the kids are winding down watching a movie when all of a sudden Sarah starts hearing noises in the house. There were footsteps shuffling like someone else was there, and she had this overwhelming feeling that she was being watched. So she gets up to check on the noise, but then the kids turn to her and say, "Oh, that's Bonnie, don't bother her." Sarah leaves it because she's freaked out, but then later that night she goes to check the nanny cam and she sees this image captured in the hallway. She stayed up until the parents came home, but she never went back after that.
This woman paid child support to her daughter's father for 13 years, completely unaware that he'd actually murdered her at the age of 6. This story is actually unbelievable, and one of the defendants is actually now facing the death penalty. On January 28, 2012, the skeletal remains of a young child were found at Brookhaven Trailer Park in Opelika, Alabama. Detectives determined that the remains belonged to an African-American girl aged 4 to 7 years old, and it was evident that she'd been abused prior to her death. Her bones showed evidence of breaks that had healed, she was malnourished, and she had an injury to her left eye socket. Forensic artists created this image of what she may have looked like, and she became known as the Opelika Jane Doe or Baby Jane Doe. It took years and years and lots of tests at the University of South Florida, and finally in 2017 it was determined that she lived in the southeast of the United States. The Opelika Police Department then teamed up with Othram Laboratories to use advanced DNA testing and genetic genealogy. A comprehensive genealogical profile was uploaded to a database, and finally in January 2023 the identity of Jane Doe was revealed. The remains belonged to 6-year-old Amor Javea Wiggins, who lived with her father and stepmother. Amor's mother, Sherry Wiggins, lived in Maryland, and she provided police with documents that showed that Amor's father and stepmother, Lamar and Ruth, had obtained legal custody of her in 2009, and it was at this time that contact with Amor's mother stopped. Despite not being allowed to see her daughter, she'd continuously paid child support since 2009. On January 17, 2023, Lamar and Ruth were arrested, and in March a hearing was held. Ruth claims that she'd become overwhelmed at having to look after Amor, so she'd asked Lamar to take her to live with family members, and that was the last time that she'd seen her. Lamar has actually confessed to murdering Amor, but says he didn't inflict any of the injuries prior to her death, and he's asked that Ruth not be charged in her murder. Ruth has since been bailed, and she has to wear an ankle monitor while she awaits trial. She's facing up to 10 years in prison. Lamar, however, was refused bail and he remains in custody. The trial's ongoing and he faces life imprisonment or the death penalty. I'll keep an eye on the case and obviously update with any developments in the comments.
This woman murdered over her obsessive need to keep shopping. In February 1994, Dana Sue Gray was in financial trouble. She'd gradually been spending more and more, well beyond her means. When she lost her job, her finances only got worse. In a desperate attempt to feed her shopping addiction, she started to do the unthinkable. Her first victim is thought to be Norma Davis. She was 86 when she was killed. Dana was never actually convicted of committing this crime due to lack of evidence. Now, Norma was actually the mother-in-law of the woman who married Dana's dad. She knew Norma well, and on February the 16th, 1994, Norma was found deceased by a neighbour. She'd been stabbed and there was no sign of forced entry. This led police to believe that the killer was probably somebody that Norma knew. She had likely willingly let the person into the house. And remember this part, the phone cord was unplugged. Now, 66-year-old June Roberts was found dead shortly after on February the 28th. Dana had gone round to her house to borrow a book off her, so June let her inside. Dana unplugged the phone from the wall and used the cord to strangle June. She then stole her credit cards and went on a shopping spree. A month later, on March the 16th, Dana took her next victim. 87-year-old Dora Beebe had just come home from the doctors when Dana arrived at her house. She asked her for some directions and she was let in. Once inside, she attacked her and killed her. Again, she stole credit cards to go on a shopping spree. She was eventually caught when she tried to kill Dorinda Hawkins. She again tried to use a telephone wire to kill her, but Dorinda, who had been left for dead, actually survived. She was then luckily able to provide police with a detailed description of what her attacker looked like. Dana was caught and found guilty and sentenced to life without parole.
Hello to all on this glorious Sunday evening. So I just thought, why not? I'm gonna do a live stream because this day next week is Christmas. What more could you want for Christmas other than an evening?
At the time that live stream was playing on YouTube, the man in the video, Stephen McCullough from Ireland, was busy murdering his partner. So this is Stephen. He was a YouTuber. He posted a lot of different random videos. He would stream and make video game live streams. And at one point in his life, he met this woman, Natalie McNally. Now, Stephen was 33, Natalie was 32 when this all happened, and when they met, they fell in love really quickly. And soon after the two met, Natalie became pregnant. She was actually 15 weeks pregnant at the time of her death. So, in later findings, it was discovered that at some point, Stephen had discovered that his partner Natalie had been communicating with another man online. And to Stephen, that was enough to sign a death sentence. So Stephen went to work planning the murder of Natalie. He pre-recorded that 6-hour-long live stream, he announced it on Twitter, and then on the evening of December 18th, 2022, Stephen aired this pre-recorded live stream on YouTube, acting like it was happening live. He even titled the stream on YouTube Violent Night Christmas Gaming Stream, which authorities have stated they believe was a clue Stephen was dropping as to what he was actually up to while this live stream was airing. So Stephen was allegedly doing this live stream in a place where he wasn't with his partner Natalie. And even though the stream started at about 4 p.m. that afternoon, at around 9 p.m., a figure was seen entering the home that he shared with Natalie. A few moments later, she is heard screaming, and then the figure leaves again, is taken by taxi to another location, and the authorities identified that figure as Stephen. As it turns out, in the days and weeks leading up to the murder of Natalie, Stephen had actually researched the most painful ways to die on Google. He'd looked up various murder methods, and it seemed like he had been planning this thing out very methodically. On that evening, Natalie, who was known to be just such a sweet woman and was remembered so fondly by her friends and family, was stabbed multiple times in her home. So after Natalie's murder, Stephen acted like he had no idea what had happened. And Natalie's family members even allowed him 20 minutes alone with her body on Christmas. They thought that at the time he was a grieving partner, not the person who had actually taken Natalie's life. I mean, there are so many sketchy things that Stephen did before and after Natalie's murder. At one point, he even left a phone recording in the same room as Natalie's family for 40 minutes just to try to see if they thought he was guilty of something. And even though he thought he was being smart and he would never be caught for this horrific crime, he's already been imprisoned.
I think most of us are familiar with this photo, but I wasn't sure about covering this case because no crime has ever been proven. But I'm interested to know your thoughts on the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. Madeleine was just 3 years old when she went missing while on holiday with her parents and her younger brother and sister. It was the evening of May 3rd, 2007 in Praia da Luz in Portugal, and according to Madeleine's parents, all three of them were put to bed and were fast asleep by 8:30 p.m. Kate and Jerry went out to dine with friends at a restaurant that was around 55 metres away, as the crow flies. However, the apartment couldn't be seen from the restaurant and they had to travel up a public street and through the hotel to get to the apartment doors, which was over 80 metres walk. Kate, Jerry and their friends periodically checked on the children around every half an hour, but when Kate went to check at 10 p.m, Madeleine was not in her bed and she hasn't been seen since. The door to the apartment had been left unlocked by Kate and Jerry, And from the restaurant, the roof of the apartment could be seen, but not the windows or doors, so they couldn't be sure whether Madeleine had just wandered off or whether she'd been taken. But Kate ran back to the restaurant and leaving the twins by themselves, screaming, "Madeleine's gone, someone's taken her." A massive search was launched and locals got involved as well, just assuming that Madeleine could have wandered off. Strangely, the apartment wasn't closed off or marked as a crime scene, despite police suspecting that she'd been abducted. She'd left her favourite cuddly toy on the bed, and they assumed that if she'd just wandered off, she would have taken that with her. DNA from one stranger was found in the apartment, but they couldn't do anything about it because as the apartment wasn't closed off, multiple people had walked through the apartment and left their DNA. Roadblocks weren't put in place until 10 a.m. the next day, and also Border Control weren't given a description of Madeleine until hours after her disappearance. Police have identified suspects since Madeleine's disappearance, and this is currently the #1 prime suspect, Christian Brugner. According to media reports, he did live in the area that Madeleine went missing around the time that she went missing, and he's also being charged for separate sex offences in 2005 in that same area. He is currently still a suspect in Madeleine's disappearance, and the investigation against him is ongoing. Kate and Jerry were obviously questioned by police, and strangely, Kate refused to answer 48 of their questions. These included: when you entered the apartment, what did you see? What did you do? Where did you look? What did you touch? Why did you say Madeleine had been abducted? Assuming Madeleine had been abducted, why did you leave the twins to go back to the restaurant and raise the alarm? What was Madeleine's behaviour like? What was Madeleine's relationship like with her brother and sister? Is it true that in England you considered handing over Madeleine's custody to a relative? In England, did you medicate your children? They were also questioned about the fact that sniffer dogs detected human blood behind the sofa in the apartment, as well as in the boot of a car rented by the McCanns. The sniffer dogs also detected a human corpse in that same vehicle. Finally, Kate was asked, did you have any responsibility or intervention in your daughter's disappearance? She refused to answer any of these questions. Kate then went on to write a book about her daughter's disappearance, and this obviously made the family a lot of money, and they ended up making 2 mortgage repayments from the Madeleine Fund. To date, the McCanns have had around £3 million in public funding to help find their missing daughter. It's now been 17 years and there hasn't been a single sighting or lead that's led to anything promising, and Madeleine, now aged 20, remains a missing person. I'd really like to get your take on this case because there are so many opinions on it, and I would like to know what you think in the comments.
It's February 2017, and a man named David Krupa hands a detective a tablet. Inside is a memory card that he thinks contains the evidence that will help them catch his stalker and allow his life to finally go back to normal. Together they sift through thousands of deleted images, but there's one photo that is not like the others. And at first, the detective isn't quite sure what he's looking at. Reddish tones, skin, but then they see a familiar tattoo. And it's this detail that begins to unravel the 5-year mystery of a deranged stalker. Rewind to spring 2012. Dave Krupa is 37 years old and has just moved to Omaha, Nebraska and is looking for a fresh start. He's recently ended a 12-year relationship with his ex-girlfriend Amy, who gave him an ultimatum basically saying, "You need to marry me or I'm out." Dave soon joins the dating site Plenty of Fish to see if he can find someone who just wants to have a good time and isn't looking for something serious. That's where he meets Shanna Liz Gollier, who simply goes by Liz. At first, things are great. The two regularly go on dates, which are pretty casual, but when things start to become more intimate, Liz wants something serious. Dave, on the other hand, isn't quite ready to get into a relationship yet, so he tells her that he wants to see other people. In October of 2017, Dave is working at his auto shop when a woman walks in that catches his eye. Her name is Carrie Farver, and she comes into the shop because her SUV is acting up again. A few days pass by, and while scrolling on the dating site Plenty of Fish, Dave comes across Carrie's profile, so he reaches out and sets up a date. However, just 2 weeks after seeing each other, he starts falling for this girl, and thinks to himself, maybe I am ready for another serious relationship. On November 13th, 2012, Dave kisses Carrie goodbye, saying that he'll see her later after she gets back from work. A few hours pass by, and that's when Dave gets a text. Carrie messages him suggesting that the two should move in together, but Dave disagrees. And when he replies no, she texts him back in all caps, "Fine. I don't ever want to see you again." And soon, Liz starts receiving messages too, demanding that she stay away from Dave or something bad was gonna happen. One night, she pulls into her garage and sees another message. Not on her phone, but spray painted on her wall reading, "From Dave." Liz's house is torched and burned to the ground. Dave is sent a picture of a body tied up in the trunk of a car, and the two both receive a fake obituary of Liz's death. Meanwhile, this consistent harassment is actually bringing Dave and Liz closer, and they bond over the horrors that this woman is putting them through. One night, while Dave is driving home in January of 2013, he spots a familiar vehicle in the parking lot of his apartment. Upon closer inspection, he realizes that it's Carrie's SUV, so he calls the police, who find little to no evidence surrounding her disappearance. However, they do manage to scrape a fingerprint off a mint container in her car, and this DNA will become crucial later in the story. This pattern of psychological and sometimes physical torment goes on for years until Dave finally decides that he's had enough. He changes his phone number, purchases a gun, and moves to Council Bluffs, Iowa, where he's forced to end his relationship with Liz. Almost immediately after the move, the gun goes missing. After Dave gets settled into his new home, the local sheriff's department takes a special interest in his case. They request that both Dave and Liz hand over their phones so they can trace Carrie's digital footprint, but when they download the data, they make a shocking revelation. After sifting through images, videos, passwords, and previous locations, they discover that it isn't Carrie who's sending these messages, it's none other than Shanna Liz Golyer. On Liz's phone, they discover that she has 20 separate email accounts, all being used to impersonate Carrie. As detectives continue building their case, gathering evidence against Liz, she actually shows up at the sheriff's department to file a complaint. She proceeds to claim that Amy Flora, Dave's ex-wife, is a total stalker. Cleverly, one of the officers says, if only Amy would implicate herself, meaning reveal herself to be the perpetrator, and thus setting in Liz's head a psychological trap. Now, as intelligent and conniving as she appears to be, the next day Liz dials 911 and tells them that Amy Flora has just shot her in the leg. And when investigators ask for more proof, Liz forwards them several emails from Amy confessing to both shooting her and impersonating Dave's ex-girlfriend Carrie. Liz thinks this plan is foolproof. It is the perfect cover-up. But the IP address attached to the emails, along with the countless other messages, all trace back to Liz. Further, police are able to match the fingerprint from the mint container in Carrie's car to Liz's DNA. And to top it all off, the bullet that was shot into Liz's leg is from the barrel of Dave's missing gun. In December 2016, Liz's case is taken to trial where she faces being charged with first-degree murder and arson. Prosecutors say that this is a case of obsession. During the trial, Dave hands over a tablet containing a memory card. On it, a grainy picture of a foot with a tattoo. It's identified that the foot had been decomposing for several days when the photo was taken, and the tattoo was a Chinese symbol identical to Carrie's, finally proving that she was dead. On May 24, 2017, Shanna Liz Golyer is found guilty of first-degree murder and arson and is sentenced to life in prison. She's currently serving out her sentence where she continues to behave in evil, manipulative ways, not revealing where Carrie's body is and denying her family of closure.
This woman screamed, "I don't want to die," as she was dragged to her death in a horrifying theme park incident. Kelty Byrne was a Canadian student, animal trainer and competitive swimmer. She was working at Sealand of the Pacific to earn extra money, and this involved being trained to work with orcas, otherwise known as killer whales. In controversial theme parks such as Sealand of the Pacific and SeaWorld, huge animals are either bred in captivity or traumatically captured and ripped apart from their families and natural habitats for humans' entertainment. On February the 20th, 1991, Kelty was working a shift and 3 whales were in one of the pools, including the infamous Tilikum. In a horrific turn of events, Kelty accidentally slipped and fell into the whale pool and attempted to grab onto the edge and save herself. However, before she could do so, she was grabbed by one of the whales that dragged her into the pool. The three whales then began throwing Kelty around, with many speculating that they may have simply thought this was a game. Others theorised that the whales were so traumatised and angered by their lives in tiny little pools that they took it out on Kelty. She was dragged under the water and then back up, screaming, "I don't want to die." After this horrific ordeal, she eventually drowned. It's reported that she was absolutely covered in bruises, was completely battered, and also covered in teeth marks.
What? Look in there, mate. Look in there. What? Look in there.
Some are calling this the most horrific fraternity hazing ever in the United States. This is how one night at university can destroy your life forever. Danny Santulli was 18 years old and a freshman at the Uni of Missouri. In October 2021, Danny was captured on CCTV being blindfolded and led downstairs in an event named Pledge Dad Reveal Night. Danny was made to drink a litre of straight vodka by himself. At around 10:55, Danny collapsed and some of the frat members were seen carrying him to a sofa. Around midnight, Danny was captured on cameras sliding off the sofa, and shortly after he was found unconscious with blue lips. Shockingly, instead of calling an ambulance for Danny, the frat members piled him into a car, dropping him on the way. They drove him to hospital, but at this point he was already in cardiac arrest. Danny had to be resuscitated and spent the next 6 weeks in intensive care. Prior to this evening, Danny had been left needing stitches and crutches after he'd been forced to climb inside of a bin with broken glass inside. 2 nights before the night in question, Danny broke down in tears on the phone to his sister and told her about how stressed he felt about it all. His family had begged him to quit the pledge, but he didn't want to be ridiculed. This is Danny now. He will need full-time care for the rest of his life. He's now severely brain damaged, is blind, and cannot walk or talk. 2 former students are set to go to trial over this case. If I didn't know this was a true crime case, I would think it was a disturbing horror film. On the morning of the 7th of October 2022, a barefoot woman was running around Excelsior Springs, Missouri, bashing on people's doors. Witnesses describe her looking like she came straight from a horror film and she was calling for help. She'd been beaten, held captive, and SA'd for weeks. The woman was a shocking sight. She was covered in injuries and was wearing a bin bag. Disturbingly, she was gasping for breath as she had a very tight metal collar locked round her neck. It was a nurse who opened the door to her and let her come in. The nurse started to call police, and at this point the woman panicked. She warned her that the captor would kill her and claimed that he had killed her 2 friends. When police got there, the woman explained that a man called Timothy had captured her the month prior. He'd been holding her hostage this whole time. She said he'd been keeping her locked in the basement and had been SAing her. Disturbingly, she told police that he actually had a young son who lived at the house with him. When Timothy had taken his young son to school the one day, she used it as her opportunity to escape. Police made their way to the home of 39-year-old Timothy Haslett Jr. and found the property did in fact have a basement like the woman described. Timothy was arrested and is facing 9 charges, including first-degree kidnapping. He's being held on a $3 million bond and faces 5 life sentences. Before his arrest, police were actually called to his address 3 times. Twice they were asked to do welfare checks, and this was from an employer and also family members. Police have searched his home with cadaver dogs and they haven't yet released what they know. This is the UK's most famous missing boy. In September 2007, Andrew Gosden was just 14 years old. He was a very intelligent boy and was top of his class in most classes at school. He was an introvert that usually spent most of his time at home. The day before Andrew went missing seemed completely normal. He went to school, he had some tea, and then he watched some TV. However, on September the 14th, he seemed more irritable than normal. Instead of getting the bus to school that morning like his parents thought he was, he went to a cash point and withdrew £200. CCTV then captures him walking home, where he changed his clothes into a Slipknot t-shirt. When he left the house, he didn't take his charger with him, and he also didn't take £100 that he'd saved up. He didn't take his passport, but he did take his house key, which indicates he was going to come home. He bought a one-way ticket to London and was last seen leaving King's Cross station at about 11:30. Frustratingly, the school had actually tried to contact Andrew's parents to say that he hadn't turned up to school that day, but they dialed the wrong number and left an answer phone message on the wrong phone. His family was completely cleared of any suspicion, and the family and the school and all of the students went to London and they were handing out loads of flyers. Weirdly, a year after this incident, a man came to a police station to say that he had information about Andrew. Now, the police station was unmanned, so the person spoke to this man just over an intercom system and sent a police officer down there. Mysteriously, by the time the police officer arrived, the person had vanished. This is what Andrew might look like now, just being the age that he may be if he's still alive. Theories about this case is that he may have gone to London to meet up with someone or go to a concert. Was he lured there by somebody with bad intentions, or was he just going there for the day, gonna come back, and was at the wrong place at the wrong time and somebody did something bad to him? In 2009, the family paid for a search of the River Thames to try and find some sort of closure. The search did find a body, but it wasn't Andrew's. The most up-to-date information that we have on this case is that 2 men were arrested on suspicion of kidnapping Andrew, but they've actually been released.